fi360 on the tools, and we're going to be covering the new My Model section of the toolkit, give you a general overview of the updates and enhancements that we created and how you can use them to kind of maximize your effort in working in the My Model section of the toolkit. Before we get started, if you do have any questions along the way, feel free to use the GoToWebinar console. There's a little question box that you can type your questions into, and feel free to type away. I'll try and get to them as we move along here. But if I don't, feel free to, again, type them in. I'll circle back and answer any questions that you have at the very end. So let's get started. And the first thing I wanted to cover is hopefully when you signed into the toolkit last week, you noticed this Getting Started guide that we have created here. And I just want to pull this up, and hopefully you've had a chance to review this, because down below it kind of explains how to go through the process of going through and converting your models. If you haven't had a chance, definitely go and check out. There's a few videos on there that will explain that process. We're not going to go through that today, but if I scrolled up to the very top, I just want to talk about how the models are laid out in the toolkit now, and really how you can kind of think about how the models are built in the way that you can kind of work with them in the toolkit. So up at the very top, what we have on this diagram here is the models. So you have a whole series of models, and when we go and look at the toolkit, we'll see how this kind of comes into play and how these examples met out. But the model you may have is just simply labeled conservative model, and this is your version of that conservative allocation that you're recommending to individual clients, to plan participants, however you want to work through that model. If you're working with 401k plans, you may build a 401k lineup model and have different versions of that model underneath. But that brings us to our second level version. So you have a conservative model, but then secondly, underneath that you have, or you can have more than one version of that model. So you may have a default model, and that's kind of how we recommend you kind of build that first model, is your default model. That's your recommended allocation towards different asset classes. And that's, again, the standard default that you may be using across the board when you're working with a client. Now, with respect to that, you can have different versions. So you may have one default version of that conservative model. You may have a slightly riskier version of that conservative model. Again, having different versions facilitates that process, because when you get into the reporting, in the end, they'll all be labeled conservative. The client in the end won't know those different versions that you have. They'll just have that default listed in that report as conservative. So you can kind of manage those different versions underneath and work through it that way. So models, versions, and then once you get to that version level, we're splitting that version level out into a strategic side and a tactical side. So again, we'll kind of see how this plays out in the toolkit. But as we look at the strategic side, really you're just defining the asset classes and the allocation. And you can kind of think of this as your long-term view, again, of what that conservative model would look like. So what asset classes are you going to use to build that model? What allocations are you going to build into that model to those different asset classes? What is your long-term view of that? And when you think about that, and again, we'll kind of see how this plays out in the toolkit, really that strategic model really isn't going to change. So really there's just one strategic allocation that you have for your model. So again, that's really not going to change over time. But what you do have on the other side is the tactical side. And this is where things can change from period to period. So again, there's just one tactical version, but underneath that tactical version can change from time period to time period. And within those time periods, you can have the models change in terms of specific investments, different allocations, so on and so forth. So what you're tracking is how are those models actually being implemented in terms of investments and allocation. So you may look at this and say there's allocations on the tactical side, there's allocations on the strategic. Again, 9 times out of 10, the allocations under strategic may line up exactly with tactical. But again, you may guess from the tactical name that that is something that may change if you want to overweight a certain asset class or underweight another asset class over time. That's where you can make those changes under that tactical and track that history over time. So let's kind of see how this all plays out as we jump into the toolkit. So again, just a nice overview of what that actually means when we go in here. So if we jump into the models area, we have what we, again, are still calling our models, but we can see how this is kind of borne out now. And again, I've gone through that process of, let me jump back here, of kind of fixing my models, going through these different options and watching these videos to kind of pare down my models and organize the models in the way that I want. Now, the models that I have listed here, let's close this 401k model for a second, but I have aggressive, balanced, conservative, and moderate. And again, for all these, I have what I call my default model, my go-to model, and it's when I'm recommending a moderate allocation to a client or to a plan. Now, you see under aggressive and moderate, I also have a different version I call extra risk. So it's something that, again, I've tweaked a little bit. I still want to keep that as something that I want to term moderate when I'm pushing it onto a report and pushing it out to a client, but it's been tweaked a little bit for a slightly different version of something that I may change long term, or just something that I want to change and recommend a slightly different allocation to a client. So building those different versions facilitates that process of keeping something under that moderate level or aggressive level, or however you want to call it, but still giving you the ability to tweak that on a version by version level. So let's see how we can create a new model. All you need to do is click on the Go button on the right side of the page, and we can either build a different version under my existing models. We can see them all listed here, or I can create a new model group. So again, I may call something, well, I've kind of used everything, so maybe I just want to create another version here, but I can create a new group here, conservative model 2. But really what I would probably want to do once I've kind of built out my core models is jump under here, go to conservative, and build out my extra conservative model, or however you want to call that. Now, as we look under all this other information that we have here, really those two fields are the only fields that I need when I'm building a model in a version, the group name and the version name. But I can quickly jump in here and add in a blended benchmark. If you're familiar with our custom universe area, we can add in a custom universe when we're building the tactical side. We'll skip over this fee schedule now. That's something that we're going to be releasing at a future date. But then inflation assumption is something that is helpful when I jump into my strategic area. So is this hypothetical amount. So this will kind of help with our process. And then finally, we have our Finimetrica risk score. If you're working with Finimetrica as a application, you can kind of work through that process and have that worked out on that side as well. But I'm going to create this extra conservative model under conservative and jump in from there. So now what we have is, again, default and extra conservative. Let's go into an example that I've already built, though, to kind of see how this would work out. And let me go into this moderate and extra risk. So let's jump in here and see how this works. So in this detail for this version, for this extra risk version, which we can see on the right side of the page, we have the strategic side on the right, or excuse me, on the left, and the tactical side on the right. If you're going into this for the very first time, you'll want to start on the strategic side first. And the reason you want to do that is, again, because this is kind of the basis of how you're going to start building these tactical asset allocation models over time. So that's why you want to start with that, with the strategic side, and build that, solidify that before you jump over to tactical. So if we jump in here, and actually let's go back to our model that we just built, extra conservative, we can see what it looks like when we jump in for the very first time. Not much going on compared to that moderate model that we were looking at just a few seconds ago. But if we're looking at the strategic side, we can see how we can build that strategic side by using the optimizer or entering tier groups manually. So if you're utilizing our optimizer and our sample efficiency process, you want to jump in and use the optimizer. If you already have pre-built models, pre-built strategic allocations, or if you're using something else outside of our optimizer, if you're using your own optimization program, you want to jump in and type in the peer group details. So I could jump in here, and if you're familiar with the toolkit, again, selecting the different asset classes on the left side, moving them over, defining the strategic allocations, and then the rebalancing limits if you want to. But since I want to use the optimizer, I'm going to jump in and work with our optimizer. And again, since we're extra conservative, I'm going to be on the lower side of the efficient frontier. Again, build that model, and then hit save. So again, without doing a whole bunch, I've built my model, build it out amongst these different asset allocations. I can go back into the peer group side, and this information is again pre-populated, so I can jump in, change the lower and upper rebalancing limits, change this number of investments if I want to, and then hit save. But again, you can kind of consider those two sides to be, again, either the peer group or the strategic allocation, and building out the strategic allocation. We'll kind of talk about what you may want to do if you don't want to have this, or vice versa, if you don't want to have tactical in just a few moments. But again, really building both sides is the best way to go, so you can utilize this model and this allocation throughout the toolkit. So I've built this strategic side. Great. Now the next thing that I want to do is begin building my tactical side. And I can go to the right side now, and I need to create my first time period. So I'm going to add the most recent time period available to me, March 31st, and jump in here and start adding investments. Now when you jump in here for the very first time, you'll see that there's not much going on. But what I can do, and again, I'm just picking some random investments, so don't track this too closely, but if I type in my very first investment, we'll see that the right side of this page is listing a whole bunch more data. I just typed in one fund, Vanguard 500, but in addition to that, it's listing all these different peer groups now. And what these target allocations listed are, that's actually our strategic allocation. So this will help guide you through the process of kind of building out that strategic allocation on the tactical side. So, and trying to hit those peer groups that you need to hit to build that diversified model. So if I just type in a few more, if I get some hits here. Oops, that doesn't help me out. All right, so as I typed in a couple of these, we'll begin to see how this kind of fills out. So again, I can have more than one fund in here. Let me type in this random one. Good. So that's the last one we want to type in. We have in here foreign large blend. Again, our strategic side says we need an allocation to foreign large blend. Again, our strategic allocation is saying that we need 3%. So as we have that investment in this MFS research, I can go in here and type in 3%. Now with this large blend area, we have two funds, Sentinel and Vanguard. And again, we have a very conservative model, not much in equities. So maybe we want to split this 1% on one and then 2% on the other. So again, we can kind of split this out if you want to as well. Let's look at this other one, this small blend. Now, again, what we have is Columbia small cap. That is the one fund. Now, it's only our strategic is only recommending 1%, but again, since this is our tactical side, we still have the freedom to type in whatever we need to and say we We want to bump that up to 5%. That's our tactical side. So really, as you're typing in these, this target is really, again, just a suggestion based off of that strategic side that you already worked with. Again, ultimately, you'd want to type in something that's equal to or pretty darn close to that, but you do have the freedom to go in here and adjust that and make changes accordingly. Now, this very last investment, this Brazil hedged equity ETF that I just randomly typed in, again, this is outside of our allocation, and it's you may be able to read here, it says investments which do not match the peer group model definition. So again, this is saying that it's outside of that target allocation. It's not in one of our recommended peer groups, but that's no worries. We can go in here and add that into our mix as well. So maybe you want to add 5% in. Now ultimately you want to fill this out, populate this, and complete this where you're hopefully hitting most of the peer groups, and in the end you have an allocation of 100% where you can hit save and exit. So in the interest of example here, I'll just kind of fill this out a little bit more. And again, not following any of my target allocations, but, well, I'll just keep it at that. Not following any of my target allocations, but now my model is hitting 100%, and I can save this into the system. Now, what I also have here is the ability to add more than one period at a time. Now, as you begin to build these tactical allocations, you'll want to jump in here as we update the data and update this information, at least in terms of the changes that you make. So as we kind of go back in time, let's go back and copy existing and build that historical period in. Our historical period for December 31st, 2011 may be the exact same allocation, exact same investment. So again, if you really want to keep up, you can add in new time periods, period by period, as the system moves along. And you will have to add in the brand new period if you need to run a report for that brand new period. But something that you may want to think about, especially since we're kind of starting at this base level right now, is if these models were built in historically, you'll at least want to build in some historical perspective as well. And we'll see where this comes into play in our reports. But what you would want to do is add new time periods for all the times that you've made changes to this tactical side. So in terms of allocation changes made or investments added or removed, you want to kind of build that into this historical period as well. So again, with my 5 investments here, maybe that's a model I've been using for a period of time for this extra conservative model. But say back in December 2009, that's where I made some changes. So I can start off by copying that data. But I see, and this is a good example, where I can go in here and make some changes. So back in that historical period of December 31st, 2009, again, the model was different. And how can I tell? Because this investment wasn't available back then, so I need to have a different allocation. So say I needed to type in this different Brazil equity ETF. Oh, that didn't work for me. Let's add this in. There we go. So this agriculture double long equity traded note, that's my investment. Hopefully you're not following me for your investment advice, but again, this is where you want to build that historical change in and maybe make some changes here and say this was actually an allocation of 20%, this was 20%, and this was 15%. So again, I can change both the investments and the allocations over time, and you'll want to do that on a period-by-period basis. Let's add one more in for going all the way back to 2003. And again, we need to jump in here and make some changes because a couple of funds now aren't available back in that time period. Let's delete those, add in some other random funds. So again, we can add these in. And, oops, I went too much. So again, I'm building that history. So again, don't follow those investment suggestions I made, but look at the history I built. I started this model back in December 31, 2003 with the allocations and investments made. Up in 2009, I made a change. So up between 2003 and 2009, my model stayed the same. So you don't have to build those period-by-period time periods into the system if there hasn't been a change historically. So you can jump in 2003, go into 2009. Now 2009 to the September 31st data period, again, everything was the same up until that period, but my tactical model changed. Again, whether it was investments or allocation, I need to make a change. And then from here on out, I'm going to start to see those investment periods being added in. So that's kind of how you want to start thinking about this tactical. Again, those periods are going to start being built in here period by period, but to build that back history, you really need to only add in the periods where those changes have been made. And we'll talk about this when we run a report, but talk about the importance of adding that history in when we look at the reports. So let me go back and pull up another moderate example here. And again, this is just a simple example of something that I built in the system before. Again, I had all my investments lined up, my history lined up, and I built a nice lineup here for those tactical investment models. So when we jump in here and look at that information and start to build a report, I can pull up some reports here, pull up these aggressive, conservative, moderate, and on the right side of the page, I can start to build some reports. Now, as we have listed over here, we have our default report templates, and you'll see some examples here in model portfolios, which is reports that we've had before and still can be used. Our fact sheet report, which we'll take a brief look at, and the optimizer, which we'll take a brief look at. As we look at these reports, keep in mind that we're still in this My Models area. We haven't actually entered the client yet, but now we can build that model portfolio report that you're building for each client. We can build that out here. That fact sheet report that you could build in a client, we can build that out here. And then the optimizer report, which you could run from here before, you can jump in and generate too. So again, this may be a report that you kind of jump in on a period-by-period basis to look at this information before you adjust it for a client. Because what we're doing here, again, if you had tracked that report that we put out there earlier, what you really have the ability to do now is just manage these 3 or 4 models and the corresponding versions for all of your clients. So we'll see how this kind of nets out when we go into a client, but you're not managing an aggressive model for client X, you're not managing an aggressive model for client Y, you're not managing a client aggressive model for client Z. If you're using the same allocation, same investments for that model portfolio for those 3 clients, you're just managing that once now, and that's being tracked into that client, and we'll see that in a second. So let's take a look at that now, and we'll actually take a look at the reports in a second. So I'm kind of on that tangent right now. Now, if I go into my client area, I can jump into my 4th Avenue Associates. And if I jump into holdings and models and go into model portfolios, oh, I built this the way I wanted. So in here, we have nothing. And again, if the models were assigned, they're still going to be assigned in here. But say this was a brand new user, I can jump in here and select these models now and assign them to the client. So what does this give me the ability to do? As you hopefully saw, I was managing my models in this global models area, And now instead of going into 4th Avenue and building out that history and that timeline for each of these models, I'm just pulling that information in. And it's pulling in that strategic side, which is important, but more importantly, it's pulling in that tactical history as well. So I'm not building that tactical history and replicating that process over and over. So another example, I can go back and pull up Blackbeard. Let's see what Blackbeard has in here. So again, same process. This client doesn't have the models, but all I need to do now is if that model is something that I'm recommending for another client and I've built that in the system, I just need to jump in here, add those in, and now I can just jump into the reports and build that model portfolio report for that client. Or again, if you're building a custom report template that includes those model portfolio sections, that information is kind of pulled in as well. So hopefully you kind of see the power of that. Let me just take one more example of, let's see, let me pull up another 401k. Let me see if I got pulled in for this. All right, so this new dimensions here. Let's jump into the models area for new dimensions. And again, we don't have anything here. Now, say I have been building those models, and those are the models that I typically use, those aggressive, conservative, moderate. But for new dimensions, they want something different. They're a client that demands something unique. So we can still go in here, create a new model, and actually let's keep that model group going. So conservative, and now I just may make one for new dimension. So again, you're kind of losing that ability to pull that information in and pull that history in, but you can jump in here, add this model in, and then this model for new dimensions is assigned in. I'll have to replicate that time history, but again, this is that model that's unique just to that client. So again, the goal is to kind of organize that information and keep it standard. Oops, just left the place I wanted to go. But to keep it standard across those different models, so you're not replicating data and building different models, but if that's how you want to do things, you can still do that and build those different model versions under that conservative name. So one more example of how you can use the, actually two more examples of how you can use those models. So again, we've built this tactical side, and that tactical side works well with those 401k model portfolios. But these models still can be used in other arenas. So because we built that strategic side, we can use that when we jump into a client. And now we're working with Alex Anderson, who actually is not a retirement plan participant client. Let's go with Cliff here since he's an individual. And Cliff is, again, someone that we want to recommend a strategic allocation to for his entire portfolio. You can jump into the IPS. And again, Cliff already has something here, but pretend, for example, that nothing's listed there. We can still use that conservative default, or that moderate default, to recommend, and it's going to pull through that strategic allocation and that strategic allocation side. So really the ability to pull that information in and organize that information can be used, again, both on that strategic and tactical side. And then our final example, before we look at some reports, is in the proposal generator. You may have noticed we made some updates to the proposal generator. Without going too far off on a tangent now, we can see that these are the most recent proposals I've been working on. I need to create a new proposal. We're off on the right side of the page. There's a create button that you can work on. And then you can kind of search all your proposals and pull that information up from the entire catalog of the proposals that you built in the system. There's some other status information that is helpful, but without going into that, let's actually go into a proposal for a client. So again, we can pull up Cliff, our client Cliff here, and we'll work with Cliff. And again, if you're familiar with the proposal side, I'm kind of moving through some of these screens pretty quickly. But if you're working with an existing proposal or building a proposal from scratch, you're going to eventually encounter these current and proposed areas where we have to kind of populate the information. So one of the options is combining a list with a strategic allocation. And this is where that strategic allocation side comes in again. Pulling in that strategic allocation, we can marry that up with a list of investments, like this retail approved funds list. And that didn't work at all. Perhaps my retail list doesn't have anything in it. Let's try that one more time. All right, there we go. I don't think my retail list had anything in it. So my institutional list did, and we populated it. The investments listed here, these peer groups are coming from that strategic side, and the investments are coming from that list. But when we kind of jump in and get to the final area, we'll have that strategic side kind of met out and pull that information in when you're working through the proposal. All right, enough of the website. Let's look at some reports. So again, keep in mind that the reports I'm pulling up right now, there's a few reports, but they're all looking at this default aggressive, default conservative, and default moderate. So I can use the checkbox to select any particular investment, or again, if these have been assigned into a client, you can run that client report, pull this information as well, and you'll get the same essential version that you're looking at. So the first report, which we can hit pretty quickly, is the optimizer report. And this report has changed a little bit, but not much going on in terms of changes. What you may have seen before is, again, the same thing you'll see at the very top of this, just the broad asset allocations to each of the different models, and then the bar charts kind of explaining that you can switch between the bar charts, which is our default, or the pie charts, if you like to show that. Down below, we have our statistics listed here. Again, the initial amount coming from the model, and then all these different stats coming from that strategic allocation. So then the second page has our risk and return, and we can see that, again, we're kind of moving along the efficient frontier in some general sense there, based on the allocations that we have to those different models, but that's what we can look at there. And, oh, there we go. Thought I missed something there. And then the very last section, and we'll see this hypothetical come into play again. But this hypothetical is looking at not only certain aspects, but let's just focus on the strategic side for a second. And what we're looking at is the hypothetical view of this model over time. So what does that mean? So if we were looking at, so let's look at moderate and focus on strategic. If we were scrolled back up here, and we held this same allocation to these exact peer groups or asset classes over time, what would that look like historically? So if we go to this hypothetical and look at this row, we can get a sense of what that would look like over these different time periods. So the different calendar years, and then the different time periods, year to date, 1, 3, 5, and 10. So that's just looking at the strategic and looking at how those peer groups would meet out over time when we're looking at at that information. So again, just a static view, but something that's helpful. Now this report is pretty unique because it shows the tactical side as well. We didn't really pull that information in, but it's pulling in that tactical side as well. So you get a sense of that tactical. We can add a custom benchmark in, and then just the model, how that's looked over time. So let me clarify that since I was looking at that again. So again, the model is what we should have been looking at. How did those peer groups look like over time, and then looking at the strategic for the peer groups. So again, keep in mind that this hypothetical, we really haven't looked at anything in terms of the history right now. We're just looking at the hypothetical look at the information. This will make a little bit more sense when we get into another report. Before we jump into the final report, the next report is our fact sheet. Again, you may or may not have had a chance to look at this. This was kind of in a beta version, but we've released it from beta. And this will give you a nice short review of the model. And again, we're looking at that model called moderate, looking at the current allocation to that model, that strategic allocation, giving you a relative look at the standard deviation. And then we're looking at the model compared to the tactical. And again, we'll see where this comes into play in our next report. But again, a side-by-side look at the model in terms of the assets and the allocations to those different asset classes. Tactical, which is those changes over time, and then a benchmark, which you can add into the report. So those are the actual investments being used. We've been pretty plain Jane in terms of changing our allocation, but hopefully if you do make some changes to the tactical, you'll get something a little more colorful than this straight bar chart over time. But then we also get the look at the different values, 1, 3, 5, and 10 if you've built that tactical side in over time as well. So again, this information is not based off of that strategic. This is based off of the tactical. So if you recall, when we were building that model, I built in the history back to 2003. That history is essential to add these 1, 3, 5 and 5-year returns in, because say I only put in March 31st, I would not get any of these periods because I only have one single period to look at. You need to have that tactical history to get this history in the system as well. Same look at the conservative, just a 2-page report, front and back, and then same with aggressive, front and back. Let's go into our model portfolio where we can talk about some of this again. Again, this model portfolio, there have been some changes, but essentially you're going to get the same information. And let's talk about that actual versus hypothetical again. And again, the actual is the strategic, or excuse me, the actual is the tactical side. Looking at that tactical model, what is that actual history in terms of changes of allocation, changes in investments over time? So again, in this example, I don't have a 10-year return because my tactical doesn't go back 10 years. It only goes back 9 or 10, but at least gives me 1, 3, 5. For my aggressive model that I built, I actually built in enough history to get that 10-year history. So again, if you're looking at something and the data's missing, it's probably because you don't have that tactical side built in. The hypothetical, again, it's just looking at the current period. So that's fine and well. If you want to just look at that information, we'll give you that information, and we'll see as we jump through this report where the differences kind of lie. But actual versus hypothetical. Hypothetical is just looking at the current period, just looking at the current allocation, looking at the current investments, and what would that portfolio look like if you held that exact same model going back over these different time periods. So again, looking at the current allocation, just a current view of the asset allocation. If you're familiar with this report, not much has changed. Same with the expense summary. Again, not much has changed here. Again, just looking at the current expense ratio. All right, so now we get into some good information here. So historical performance, and we'll see, again, compare this. I'm going to quickly scroll, to hypothetical. So keep in mind that there's another report that looks strikingly similar, but this historical performance is that tactical model again. So based on the history that you've entered, based on, again, if I had that extra model in going back to 2003, that I'd have that information. But this is that history of that tactical, those periods that you've entered over time. Again, if I've only entered March 31st, 2012 and December 31st, 2011, I'm not going to get anything here. I'm actually going to get the quarter period, but I'm not going to get much because I've only entered a quarter's worth of history. I need to have that tactical history over time to have this historical look go in, because this is that actual history over time. And as we look at this, we can see that all that different information is being added in. The model, the benchmark, the strategic peer group, and the tactical peer group. So the blue is really what that model looks like. The tactical peer group is looking at the peer group, and the strategic is looking at that strategic. And we'll kind of talk about that in a different section, but we get all these different comparisons on this report. Risk return comparison, again, this is going to look at the history. So again, if you don't have that tactical side, you're not going to get much from this. You need to build in that history. But once you do, you'll get a 3-year chart and a 5-year chart if you have enough history. Pretty straightforward. All right, hypothetical. So again, looking at the difference between the historical and hypothetical. What are we looking at here? We're looking just at that current period. So let me find my scroll bar here. I'll go back up here to the top and look at this, moderate, conservative, aggressive. Look at this current allocation. Look at these current investments. What if I'd held this moderate model with these same investments, same allocations going back? What would that look like? That's what this hypothetical is giving me. So it's just looking at that specific information, that specific investment for this current period, 3/31/12, going back over time, looking at that. So again, why are we showing these two? Again, it's a matter of choice. Again, with the toolkit, you can build your own custom model report and mix and match these. Again, you may just use one or the other. But if you are just starting out and you don't want to build that back history in, this is an appropriate report section to build into your custom report. With not much effort, you get a short-term view of what's going on. But this historical is a better view because, again, it's taking into account those changes in your allocations over time that you've made, the changes in investments over time that you've made, and giving you a truer picture of that historical look of the model. So historical versus hypothetical. And just to kind of reference back to the report that you've seen in the toolkit before, that model portfolios report, this is the chart that you've been looking at. It's the underlying calculations have been adjusted slightly, but this is still that same hypothetical look, that same backtest look that you were looking at earlier. All right. So the last section, and before we get into the investment details, is performance attribution. And this is a section that I think you'll find pretty valuable, because this will, again, if you've built that history over time, hopefully you've added some value into the process of just selecting a single investment. Hopefully you've added some value into the process over time, other than just putting everything into cash. And this is where this can kind of be pulled out and shown to a client. So let's take a look at just this moderate investment here in this moderate model and start from the top. So the very first investment that we have here, the very first line gives you the risk-free portfolio, the 3-month T-bill. So over the quarter, 1, 3, 5, and 10-year return, what would the expected return be if you just held the T-bill? So those are the returns. Those are kind of static in that report. Just gives the user a baseline of what to look at. So again, hopefully there's been some value add into the process. So that next value add is the strategic allocation, creating a diversified portfolio, hopefully adding some riskier asset classes, but having them correlate with other asset classes to create a addition into that process. What has that strategic allocation added into the process? Well, this is the addition of those pieces. So just by creating a diverse portfolio, again, for this moderate, we've added 7.63% to our quarterly return. Pretty darn good. All right, next line, value added by tactical asset. So just looking at that strategic, what have you done to add value into the process by adding in changes and adjustments in terms of the tactical asset allocation? So again, looking at the tactical side, we're just looking at the changes in asset allocation. Have you been overweighting or underweighting different asset classes? Has that added value? So we can see here where certain time periods it has added value. 3-year return, it fell down a little bit, but 5-year return, we've added a little bit of value into the process by making adjustments into the tactical side of the allocation changes over that strategic side. Next line, investment selection. So in terms of actually selecting investments, has that added any value? We can see that we've added value. So add that all up, we get our model return. So again, the model return for the quarter is 9.06, and it's broken down into these different components. So again, this is pretty valuable when you're looking at that, because you're again showing how that model is being adjusted over time. Value by adding an allocation, value by adding some adjustments to that allocation over time, value by selecting appropriate investments over time. That all totals up to the model return for those different time periods. Pretty neat stuff. So the rest of this report, standard performance, and then the individual investment snapshot, same stuff that you've seen before. But again, this performance attribution side, and then the historical is the same, but this historical performance side, 2 new additions, which we think add a lot of value to helping explain those model portfolios for your clients. So that about wraps everything up. Again, hopefully you kind of see what changes have been made, how you can kind of work through that process of building the models and building that strategic and tactical side, and then with the reports, what value that adds into the process, into the reporting process. So again, one final thing to kind of think about, again, looking at those model portfolios, really being able to track that history over time. You may think that, boy, that's something that I just don't want to do. But again, pulling in with 408B2 and just disclosure in general, this is where the regulation is pushing you towards. So that's why we've added this in and built this into the system. Again, it adds a lot of value, but it is kind of being pushed in terms of what needs to happen over time. And again, just restructuring this whole global models area. Again, if you're only recommending a few models, there's less work for you to do. You just need to update a few models over time instead of going into each client. So even if I go into my 4th Avenue Associates now, all that information and that same report can be produced in here for that client without having to jump in here and make those changes for that client period by period. I'm making that on that model level, and every client that holds that model, that information is going to be pushed out and used for that client model that you're using. And there's a few minutes left here for questions if there are any. Again, the question panel, you can type in any question that you have. Feel free to shoot me any questions that you have here. I'll stay on for a couple more minutes, but we're going to wrap it up today. Again, I thank you for attending, and hopefully you got some valuable information on the changes to the My Models area.